I work as a supervisor in a rundown warehouse district on the outskirts of town. It's as dull as it sounds. My job is simple. Check the warehouses, make sure everything's in order, lock up at the end of my shift. That's it. Nothing exciting, nothing out of the ordinary. At least, that was the case, until Warehouse 13 reopened. Warehouse 13 had been abandoned for years. According to some of the old-timers, it used to store outdated, broken-down equipment, things nobody wanted or needed anymore. But one day, for reasons no one explained, it was sealed up tight, and nobody went near it. Recently, however, with the company needing extra storage space, it was cleaned out and put back in use. I was assigned to monitor it like the others. Routine, right? But from the moment I stepped inside Warehouse 13, I felt off. The door itself looked like it might fall apart if you stared at it too hard, and the inside, pitch black, dank, the air thick with mold and rot. A single flickering bulb hung from the ceiling, casting weak, spasmodic light over the darkened space. Nothing to worry about, I told myself. At least that's what I thought, until the weird stuff started happening. One night, as I was finishing my rounds, I heard something. A metallic screech, sharp and grating, like steel grinding against steel. I froze, straining to listen. The sound came from deep inside the warehouse. My first instinct was to blame the wind. Only, the windows were all sealed shut. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside to investigate. The darkness swallowed me whole, the rows of rickety wooden shelves looming like skeletal sentinels. Everything was covered in layers of dust, so thick it was clear no one had touched anything here in years. Yet, as I ventured deeper into the warehouse, the scraping noise stopped. The air grew heavier, colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I was about to turn back when I spotted something. A door. A small, rusted metal door tucked behind a stack of crates. I had walked this place 100 times, but I could have sworn I'd never seen that door before. It didn't belong there. It was old, the hinges corroded, and it had no lock. My pulse quickened as I debated whether to open it. Something about it drew me in. Something wrong. I grabbed the handle, gave it a pull, and the door groaned open to reveal a narrow staircase descending into the earth. A gust of freezing air rushed up to meet me, sending chills straight down my spine. There shouldn't have been a basement here. None of the blueprints showed one, but here it was, like a secret buried beneath Warehouse 13. I switched on my flashlight and started down the stairs, fighting back the dread pooling in my gut. Steps stretched longer than they should have, lit winding deep underground, far beyond what seemed possible. My sense of time warped. Minutes felt like hours as I descended, the weight of the unknown pressing down on me. After what seemed like an eternity, I reached another door. No markings, no signs, just cold steel. I took a deep breath, turned the handle, and stepped inside. The room was vast, empty. My flashlight's beams swept across the barren concrete floor, finding nothing. But at the center of the room was a metal table. On it, a notebook, old and crumbling, edges of the pages yellowed with age. I approached it cautiously, flipping it open. The handwritten notes inside were scrawled in thick, erratic strokes. Each page described gruesome experiments in chilling detail. My skin crawled as I read. August 5, subject to 47. Result, unsuccessful. Subject expired 72 hours after injection of Compound X. September 17, subjectum 53. Severe neurological damage. Subject exhibited extreme aggression. Immediate isolation required. October 30, all data transferred. Laboratory closed indefinitely. No further access permitted. I stopped cold when I heard it. The faintest of sounds from the far end of the room. A low, tortured moan like someone struggling to cry out, but too weak to do so. My heart pounded in my chest, and a slick wave of cold sweat ran down my back. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, and my stomach twisted. Huddled in the corner, barely visible in the shadows, was someone, or something. Figure was contorted, skin sagging and charred in places, patches of hair clinging to its scalp. Its eyes, bulging and wild, caught the light. It was human, or had been. I stumbled backward, the horror of it all sinking in. The thing in the corner dragged itself toward me, its voice a raspy whisper, words too garbled to make out. I ran. I bolted up the stairs, breath ragged, heart hammering against my ribs. The echo of my footsteps rang out in the narrow stairwell as I raced back to the surface. I didn't stop until I slammed the door behind me and locked it. The whole time, I expected someone, to grab me from behind. That night, sleep was impossible. All I could think about was the notebook, the experiments, the deformed man, or whatever he was, down there in the dark. How could something like that exist, hidden beneath the warehouse? How had no one known? The next morning, I went to report it to the higher-ups. But when I returned to Warehouse 13, I found the door to the stairwell was gone, vanished as if it had never been there at all. No sign of disturbance, no hidden panel, just a blank wall where it had stood. For a long time I stood there, trying to make sense of it all. But the truth gnawed at me. Whatever had been hidden beneath Warehouse 13 was real, and some things, once uncovered, don't want to stay buried. It was a dreary, rainy night when I finished my shift at the diner. I worked late nights, and on nights like this, I often felt an inexplicable surge of energy. Maybe it was the constant caffeine and adrenaline, or maybe it was just the quiet of the empty streets that left me feeling restless. Either way, I knew I'd need a melatonin to get any sleep once I got home. I drove my usual route, a winding road that was scenic during the day, but became a pitch-black tunnel of nothingness at night. The road was dotted with the occasional parking lot of small family-owned stores and restaurants, but mostly it was just stretches of dense forest and shadows, the kind of road you wouldn't want to be stranded on. As I passed one of these forlorn parking lots, I saw a figure under a lone streetlight, waving her arm frantically. My headlights illuminated a woman in her mid-50s, tall and thin, drenched by the pouring rain. She was drenched to the bone, her clothes clinging to her like a second skin. My first thought was, not another hitchhiker, but there was something about her that made me hesitate. I slowed down and rolled down my window. "Do you need a ride?" I called out over the roar of the rain. The woman approached, a look of relief washing over her face. "Oh, thank you. You're a hero," she shouted, her voice strained and thin. Her smile was wide, but there was something unsettling about it, an odd, almost desperate edge to it. I noticed she was missing a few teeth, her mouth a gap-toothed grin that made my skin crawl. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation casual. "Just up the road to town," she replied, her voice cracking with each word. She climbed into the car, and I could feel the seats becoming damp. I told myself I was just doing a good deed, but as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Her wet clothes had an overpowering odor, masked somewhat by the rain, and her hair, normally scraggly, was now slick and straight. I pulled into a gas station at the intersection, deciding to fill up. I offered to get her anything from inside, but she declined. "No, thank you, dear," she said. I left her in the car and went inside to pay and grab a few drinks. When I returned, the woman was gone. I scanned the tiny parking lot, but she had vanished without a trace. I felt a twinge of guilt and concern, but also a strange sense of relief. I filled up my tank and headed home. My apartment is on the ground floor of a two-family house. The front door is usually left unlocked, with the two apartment doors locked separately. I entered out of the rain and made my way inside. I set the drinks on the counter and took a melatonin, hoping it would ease me into sleep. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the image of that woman from my mind. Around midnight, I woke up in my dark bedroom. This was unusual. Melatonin usually knocked me out cold. I reached for my water, and that's when I saw it. A shadowy figure crouched in the corner of my room, hidden behind the dresser. My heart leaped into my throat. Was I dreaming? Slapped my face, trying to wake myself up. The figure stood up and walked toward the door. I was paralyzed, unable to make a sound. When it left, the silence was deafening. No footsteps, no creaks from the door. I grabbed my phone and dialed my dad, my hands shaking. "Dad, you have to help me. There's someone in my room." He sounded groggy. "Trish, it's probably just a night terror. You know how these things can be." I stayed on the phone with him, pacing around the apartment, turning on lights. The living room was empty. I checked every corner, but I found no sign of anyone. Rational part of me wanted to believe it was all a nightmare, but my gut told me otherwise. That night, I locked my bedroom door and tried to sleep, though sleep was elusive. In the morning, I awoke to find the door to the foyer unlocked. My heart sank. I rechecked the apartment. Nothing seemed out of place, except for one thing. My gym blanket was missing from the back of my car. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. That woman must have slipped into my car while I was inside the gas station. Somehow, she had managed to get into my apartment. Panic set in. Called my dad again, my voice trembling. "Dad, my blanket is gone. I think she got into the car. What do I do?" "Check to see if anything else is missing. If not, calling the police might not do much. They'll just take a report," advised, trying to calm me. I searched the apartment, but nothing else was missing. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. I decided to skip the gym and lock myself inside, hoping I'd feel safer. But the unease never left me. I knew I couldn't stay here forever. A month later, I found a new place. The old apartment had become a dark reminder of that terrifying night. Every little noise made me jump. I couldn't help but think of that woman, the stranger in the rain. When I was a kid, my family moved into an old house on Winter Street. It was built in 1923, and despite its outwardly charming appearance with its quaint brick facade and ivy-covered walls, it was the sort of place that made me feel uneasy from the moment I set foot inside. I grew up in a family of skeptics. We weren't particularly religious, nor did we believe in the supernatural. But what happened in that house defied all rational explanation. The house had an unsettling atmosphere that seemed to cling to every corner. My sister and I shared a room upstairs. It was a large, dusty space with creaky wooden floors and an old-fashioned accordion door that never quite reached the floor. The first incident that made me question my sanity occurred shortly after we moved in. One evening, as I sat on my bed reading a book, I heard the floorboards creak outside our door. It was a sound you'd expect from someone walking down the hallway. I glanced up just in time to see a white, misty figure pass by the crack at the bottom of the door. My heart raced, and I waited for the familiar sight of my mother's feet to appear, but they never did. I crept to the door and looked through the gap. Nothing. The hallway was empty. There was no breeze, no open windows, just an eerie silence. I was left feeling unsettled, but I told myself it was just my imagination. Later that week, I was alone in the room when the lamp on the wardrobe began to sway violently. The base rattled and the light flickered erratically. I was terrified and ran downstairs, only to be met with puzzled looks from my family. They dismissed my fear, but I noticed a strange look in their eyes, as if they were hiding something. Another incident occurred during a summer afternoon when the electricity was cut off. My father had turned off the breaker while working on the garage, and there was no power in the house. My sister and I were sitting in the living room when the window air conditioner suddenly roared to life. We stared at each other in disbelief and rushed outside to tell our parents. My father was baffled, insisting it was impossible since the electricity was shut off. We had no explanation, only an overwhelming sense of dread. Things continued to escalate. One day, I left a fan on in my room while I went downstairs to shower. When I returned, the fan was off. My mother and sister, who had been home the entire time, denied touching it. I felt a creeping sense of paranoia. Why would the fan turn off on its own? Feeling of being watched grew stronger. We had an old cassette recorder, and I once left it running while I went to play outside. When I played back the tape, it sounded like a man and a woman were arguing. Their voices were faint and distorted, but I knew I was alone in the room at the time. At night, I would see strange flickering lights in the dark, like tiny sparks floating in the air. I now recognize them as what people call orbs, but then they frightened me deeply. I would rush to my mother's room, only to be reassured it was just my eyes playing tricks. I was too young to understand, but my nights were filled with an inexplicable terror. One recurring nightmare involved a little girl in a white nightgown, crying in the hallway because the house was on fire. I would wake up in a panic, checking every electrical outlet to ensure everything was safe. The fear of fire became a constant companion. It wasn't until I worked at the local library that I learned about the house's history. Before it was built, a hotel had stood on that land. It burned down in the late 1800s, killing many people. This revelation sent chills down my spine. It seemed that the land itself carried a dark history. My father, who had been the most skeptical of us all, began to question his own beliefs when he started hearing about our experiences. My brother, who worked late nights, often came home to hear someone calling his name. He thought it was our mother, only to find her asleep in her room. The feeling of being watched became unbearable, and he began staying over at friends' houses. One night, my sister woke up to find a figure sitting beside her bed, holding her hand. He thought it was me, but when she turned and saw I was asleep, the figure vanished. To this day, she sleeps with her head under the covers, her arms tucked tightly. My mother had the most terrifying experiences. She once felt a hand on her chest when she nearly fell down the basement stairs. The touch was gentle, but it stopped her from falling. Another time, while vacuuming my brother's room, she heard the vacuum turn on and start moving across the floor by itself. She ran upstairs to find everything as she had left it, with no one else in the house. The phone would ring incessantly, with no one on the other end or only static. Occasionally a voice would say, "I saw Barnabas leave for work." Police were involved but couldn't trace the calls. After we moved, the calls stopped. My mother was worried the spirits might follow us. One morning, she found an old Bible on her nightstand with the words highlighted, "This house will be my home forevermore." Thankfully, the spirits didn't follow us. Living in that house had a profound effect on me. I became more sensitive to the supernatural, though I try to stay rational. The experiences in that house left me with a deep understanding that there are things beyond our comprehension. Moving out was a relief, and I'm grateful for the experience because it taught me that there is more to life and death than we can understand. We had only been in our new house for a month when my son Sam first mentioned it. He was playing in the backyard with his twin sister Robbie when he casually said, "Dad, why does the man next door always watch us?" I had just finished unpacking the last of the box and was finally able to sit down and enjoy a moment of peace. My wife, Carol, was busy setting up the kitchen, and the kids were frolicking in their new inflatable pool. The sun was blazing, and the backyard was filled with their happy squeals. But as I heard Sam's question, chill ran down my spine. Our old house, a corner property with a huge backyard, had been the scene of something so disturbing that we'd been forced to move. But I wasn't prepared for history to repeat itself so soon. "What do you mean, buddy?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Sam looked at me with wide, innocent eyes. "The man next door, he's always staring at us, and sometimes he has a shiny thing that flashes." I took a deep breath. The old house had been a nightmare of unwanted glances and unsettling occurrences, but I was determined to put it behind us. I glanced at our new neighbor's house, a modest two-story with overgrown hedges obscuring most of it. I hadn't seen much of the man next door, whose name was Steve, but I knew he had moved in only a few months before us. Later that evening, as Carol and I were preparing dinner, the kids went outside to play again. It was a hot, sticky summer day, perfect for cooling off in the blow-up pool. Their laughter echoed through the yard, but then it fell silent. Robbie came running inside, face ashen. "Dad, there was a flash from the neighbor's window," he said, her voice trembling. "It was really bright, like a camera flash." I frowned, trying to stay calm. "Are you sure it wasn't just a reflection or something?" Robbie shook her head vigorously. "No, it was a flash, like someone was taking a picture of us." Carol's face turned pale as she overheard the conversation. "You should go over there and check it out. See if Steve's home and ask him about it." I nodded, though my gut was telling me something was wrong. I walked next door and rang the doorbell, but after a few attempts, Steve didn't answer. His car was parked in the driveway, so he had to be home. I knocked a few more times and even tried calling out to him, but there was no response. When I returned to Carol, I told her what had happened. He wasn't home, but the kids are sure they saw something. Carol looked worried. "We need to keep an eye on this. It could be nothing, but with what happened at the old house." A few weeks passed, and the unsettling feeling didn't fade. One night, as Carol and I were drifting off to sleep, I heard a noise outside. Something soft and barely perceptible. Carol was already half asleep, but I gently shook her awake. "Did you hear that?" I asked, straining to listen. Carol frowned. "I don't hear anything." I slipped out of bed and went downstairs to the backyard. The rain had stopped, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. I turned on the outdoor lights and scanned the yard, found nothing out of the ordinary. The lights from Steve's house were on, though, and I noticed something strange. I walked over to the fence and peered into Steve's backyard. He suddenly appeared on the other side of the fence, startling me. "Can I help you with something?" he asked, his voice gruff. "I heard something outside. Have you seen or heard anyone sneaking around?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Steve shook his head. "No, I haven't seen or heard anything. Is everything okay?" I hesitated, but decided to ask directly. "Kids thought they saw a flash coming from one of your windows. Is there a reason for that?" Steve's reaction was immediate and intense. Seemed genuinely offended, face reddening. "How dare you accuse me of that? I have nothing to do with your kids." I tried to defuse the situation, apologizing and retreating back to my house. Carol was livid when I told her. "He's hiding something. I know it. He's up to something." Despite our growing concerns, we couldn't prove anything. Life went on, but the discomfort never left. Then, one night, everything changed. I was jolted awake by Carol shaking me urgently. "Ryan, the kids are screaming." I leapt out of bed, my heart pounding. I rushed to their room, where Robbie was crying uncontrollably, and Sam was huddled under the covers, shaking. "What happened?" I asked, kneeling beside them. Robbie managed to choke out between sobs. "There was someone outside the window." Flash came from his window again. My blood ran cold. "Did you see who it was?" Robbie shook his head. "No, it was too dark." I took the kids upstairs to our room, letting them sleep with us for comfort. Carol and I lay in bed, both on edge. I peeked out the window towards Steve's house, now eerily dark. I saw him, Steve, standing in one of the upstairs windows, watching us. His face was partially obscured by shadows, but his eyes glowed with an unsettling intensity. My anger flared, and I stormed outside. I banged on Steve's door repeatedly, but he didn't answer. I tried calling the police, reporting the incident, but it seemed they couldn't do much without solid evidence. For days, Steve avoided any contact. I would see him peeking through the curtains when I was outside, but he never came out. It was clear he was avoiding me deliberately. Carol and I decided enough was enough. We couldn't live like this, and the kids' safety was paramount. Within a month, we moved to a new house in a different town. The new place was a relief. Quiet, safe environment, where the kids could play without fear. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. I often found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see Steve or some sign of him. One evening, while unpacking boxes in the new house, Sam asked, "Dad, is the man next door going to come here?" I froze. "Why do you ask that, Sam?" Sam shrugged, his face filled with innocent curiosity. He was always watching us. I thought maybe he would come here too. I hugged him tightly, trying to reassure him. "No, sweetheart. We're safe here. We won't have to worry about him anymore." Despite my reassurances, the lingering fear of the unknown never completely disappeared. I occasionally found myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if the darkness would ever catch up with us. The old house was behind us. The shadow of that man, the Watcher, still loomed large in my mind. In the end, we had escaped one nightmare, but the echoes of that experience stayed with us. You ever find yourself in a situation where a neighbor's gaze feels too intense, where shadows seem to watch you from afar? Remember our story. Sometimes, it's better to move on before the darkness can follow you, because once it does, you may find that there's no escaping the Watcher. I was just 9 years old when the night that would haunt me for the rest of my life began. I remember it as clearly as if it happened yesterday. My parents had gone out for the evening, leaving me alone in the house, a rare occurrence. It was supposed to be a quiet night of video games and comfort, but it quickly turned into something far more sinister. I was upstairs in my room, completely absorbed in the pixelated world of Metroid Prime on my GameCube. My little room was a sanctuary of sorts, where I could lose myself in alien worlds and escape the mundanity of my everyday life. The house was silent, except for the soft hum of the game console and the occasional creak of the floorboards. It was a peaceful, if slightly lonely setting. Suddenly, the house phone rang from downstairs. My mother had always insisted that I answer it if I was alone, just in case it was her calling. I sprinted down the stairs, the wooden steps groaning under my weight. By the time I reached the kitchen, the phone had rung 4 times. I picked it up, noting the caller ID displayed my mom's cell phone number. "Hello," I said, trying to sound casual. "Sweetie, can you come outside and help with the groceries?" The voice on the other end was unmistakably my mother's, but something about it felt off, distant, almost mechanical. My heart skipped a beat. My mom never called me sweetie like that, especially not in such a robotic tone. "Mom?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why do you sound like that?" "Like what, sweetie?" she replied, and the way she repeated that word made my skin crawl. I didn't know why, but something in me screamed that it wasn't her. I slammed the phone down, my mind racing. The phone rang again almost immediately. My mom's number flashed on the screen once more. I didn't answer. My fear mounted as I considered what was happening. The phone rang a 3rd time, but this time the number was different. Hesitant, I picked up. "Hey James," a gravelly voice said. "I know this is going to sound weird, but it's your dad. I'm outside." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. My dad had died when I was only 3 years old. I had no memories of him. "What?" I managed to croak out. "I'm outside," the voice insisted. I have a lot to explain. My heart pounded in my chest as I hung up. This was not my mom. This was not my dad. The ringing stopped, but my anxiety did not. Phone was silent for a moment, but then the knock came. Knock, knock, knock. I froze, the sound echoing through the empty house. I crept to the window, peeking through the blinds. There was no one to be seen. The knocks continued. I could hear a man's voice, muffled and eerie, calling out my name. "James, it's your dad." I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the rug. I knew I had to call 911. I grabbed the phone with trembling hands and dialed the emergency number. The operator's voice was calm and steady, a stark contrast to my panic. "911, what's your emergency?" "There's someone outside my house," I whispered urgently. "They're trying to get in." The operator asked me a series of questions that I could barely answer. She instructed me to find a room with a lock and stay there until the police arrive. I bolted to the bathroom on the 1st floor, the only room with a lockable door. I turned off the lights and huddled in the corner, trying to keep my breathing quiet. I could hear the intruder trying each window and door, the sound of their frustrated grunts and muffled curses filling the house. It was clear there were at least 2 people involved, a man and a woman, their efforts coordinated and relentless. The minutes felt like hours as I waited in the darkness. I could hear the struggle intensify, the scraping of metal against wood as they tried to force their way in. Then, as suddenly as it began, the noises stopped. The house fell into an eerie silence. After what seemed like an eternity, the operator's voice crackled over the line, informing me that the police had arrived and it was safe to come out. I slowly opened the bathroom door and crept into the living room. The police were already at the front door, their presence a relief. They conducted a thorough investigation, inside and out. They asked me about my mom and whether she knew anyone who might want to hurt us. I told them she was supposed to be out grocery shopping and that I didn't know of anyone who might pose a threat. Their questions were probing, and their concern was evident. When my mom returned, she was frantic. She had brought my little sister with her, both of them bewildered by the sight of police cars parked outside our home. My mom's phone had been stolen, which explained how the intruders had obtained our number. The police confirmed that the phone was likely used to track us down, as it had a picture of our family as the background. This detail, though chilling, gave a clearer picture of their intent. My mom's reaction was a mix of relief and guilt. She vowed never to leave me alone again. The event changed everything. The house no longer felt like a safe haven, but rather a place filled with shadows and echoes of that night. My mom stayed close, never leaving me alone at night again until I was old enough to fend for myself. But the terror didn't end with that night. Every knock on the door, Every unfamiliar phone call, every shadow that danced on the walls of our house was a reminder of that evening. I would often lie awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the memory of that voice calling my name. It was a reminder that danger could come from anywhere, even from the people who were supposed to protect us. Sarah and I had just moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood on Long Island. It was one of those places where nothing exciting ever happened, which was perfect for us. We had rented a small house, cozy enough for the two of us, with a decent-sized backyard, shielded from the outside world by a tall wooden fence. The street was peaceful, tucked away from the main roads, with only a handful of houses around. To one side was a drainage basin surrounded by trees, and to the other side, our only visible neighbors, an older couple in their 60s, lived in silence. Across the street from us was a small patch of woods, which blocked the view of another drainage basin. It was the kind of place you might call idyllic, but there was something off from the start that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was the isolation, the quiet that felt a little too quiet, or maybe it was the house behind ours. There was just one house that could see into our backyard over the fence. It stood slightly taller than ours, with a second-floor window overlooking our space. We didn't think much of it at first. After all, it's not unusual for houses to have windows facing each other. But as the days passed, Sarah and I started to feel watched. It began with the fall cleanup. I was out in the yard, raking leaves, when I noticed them for the first time. Two figures, a middle-aged man and woman, standing at the upstairs window of the house behind ours, staring. They were just standing there, their faces pressed against the glass, watching me as I worked. It was unsettling, but I tried to ignore it. People are nosy sometimes, right? No harm in it. But they didn't stop. Every time I went out into the yard, there they were, standing at the same window, watching. Their eyes followed my every move, never blinking, never shifting. It was as if they had nothing better to do than stand there and stare. Sarah noticed it too. "They're always there," she said one night, glancing nervously at the window. "It's creepy. Why don't they ever leave?" I tried to reassure her, but I was just as creeped out. We pretended not to notice for as long as we could, but eventually it got to the point where Sarah refused to go into the backyard. She was too uncomfortable with those people watching us. Their presence felt invasive, almost sinister. One foggy afternoon, I decided to test something. While I was out raking, I looked up at the window and waved at them, trying to be friendly. They didn't wave back. They didn't even flinch. They just stood there, eyes locked on me, their expressions blank, almost lifeless. It sent a chill down my spine. That was the moment I decided enough was enough. "We should go introduce ourselves," Sarah suggested one evening after dinner. "Maybe if we meet them, it won't feel so weird." I didn't like the idea, but Sarah was persistent. We walked around the block to their house and rang the doorbell. After a long, tense wait, the door creaked open just a crack. A young man, probably in his 20s, peered out at us. His face was half hidden behind the door, and the house behind him was dark, eerily dark. "Hi," Sarah said, trying to sound cheerful despite the unsettling atmosphere. "We live behind you. We just wanted to introduce ourselves." The man didn't smile. He barely even acknowledged us. "What do you want?" His voice was cold, almost robotic. "We've noticed two people at the window a lot," I said, glancing at the upstairs window where the watchers always stood. "A man and a woman. We just wanted to say hello, maybe get to know our neighbors." The man's expression didn't change. "There's no one else here," he said flatly. Sarah and I exchanged uneasy glances. "But we've seen them. They're always at the window." "I don't know who you're talking about," the man said, his voice tinged with annoyance. Then, without another word, he shut the door in our faces. As we walked back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The man's reaction, the darkness of the house, the strange, unsettling energy, it all felt off. That night, I went upstairs to our bedroom, which had a window facing that same house. I peeked out, and there they were again, the man and woman, standing at the window, staring. This time, though, it was worse. Even from this distance, I could tell they weren't just looking out the window. They were looking directly at me. I shut the blinds, heart racing, and went downstairs to tell Sarah. "We're planting trees," I said. "First thing next spring. I don't care how much it costs, we need to block that window." The next few days, we tried to avoid looking outside. We avoided the backyard altogether. But one night, around 11 p.m., we heard a strange knocking sound. It wasn't coming from the front door or even the side door. It was coming from the backyard. "Wait," I told Sarah, trying to sound braver than I felt. I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a baseball bat, and headed downstairs. The knocking grew louder as I approached the living room. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the sound wasn't just random tapping. It was deliberate, insistent. Someone was knocking on the glass of one of the backyard windows. The blinds were drawn, and I had no intention of opening them. Instead, I turned on the backyard light, hoping to scare off whoever or whatever was out there. The knocking stopped instantly. I stood there, frozen, listening to the silence. I didn't dare look out the window. My mind was racing with thoughts of those figures at the window, and now I was terrified they were somehow in the yard. I went back upstairs and told Sarah everything was fine, that I had scared whoever it was away. But the truth was, I hadn't seen anyone. I didn't know who or what had been out there. For the next 2 weeks, things were quiet. Figures at the window seemed to disappear, and we started to feel a little more comfortable. But then, late one night, we were woken by the sound of yelling. It was coming from the house behind ours. I opened our bedroom window and listened. The screams were muffled but loud, like someone was in a lot of pain. The yelling continued for a few minutes, and then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. We debated calling the police, but in the end, we didn't. Something about that house made me hesitate, as if involving the authorities would make things worse. The next morning, I checked the window again. The house was as still and quiet as ever. No sign of movement, no sign of life. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened in that house. And then, a few nights later, it happened again. We were asleep when I heard a loud thud from the backyard. I bolted upright, my heart racing, and looked at the clock. It was 3 a.m. I nudged Sarah awake and we both listened in the dark. There it was again, a thud followed by scraping like something heavy being dragged across the ground. I grabbed the baseball bat and crept downstairs. The backyard light was still on, but the yard itself was empty. The noise, however, continued, coming from behind the fence, from the house where those figures had been watching us. I stood at the window, staring into the darkness, my breath fogging up the glass. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. Figure. A man, standing in the shadows near the fence, staring at our house. I couldn't see his face, but I knew it was one of the people from the window. He stood there, motionless, for what felt like an eternity. And then slowly, he raised his hand and waved. I backed away from the window, my blood turning to ice. I ran upstairs, grabbed Sarah, and we left the house that night, not bothering to pack anything. He never went back. A few days later, I checked the local news. There was a report of a body found in the drainage basin behind the houses. They didn't give any details, but I knew, somehow, I knew it was connected to the house behind ours. We moved far away after that to a place where the neighbors don't watch from their windows, and there are no dark houses lurking behind ours. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up and wonder if they're still watching. And if one day, they'll find us again. It was a cold weekend night in November of 2015, the type of night where the wind howled through the trees and the cold seemed to creep into your bones. My 7-year-old son, Sean, was having a sleepover with 4 of his friends. It was supposed to be an exciting night for them, filled with pizza, video games, and endless laughter. My wife wasn't home for the evening. She had gone out for some event, leaving me in charge of keeping an eye on 5 rowdy kids. The thing is, anyone who's been married knows that there's always an unspoken rule. Follow your wife's instructions. She told me to keep an ear on them, but to not hover. I wasn't too worried. After all, it was just 5 7-year-olds in the house. What could possibly go wrong? The night started like any other sleepover. Sean and his friends were in his room, making all kinds of noise. Every now and then, when things got either too loud or too quiet, I'd sneak over to his bedroom door, lean in, and just listen. It sounds a little creepy, I know, but I wasn't spying. I just wanted to make sure they weren't breaking anything, or each other. I remember one time it got really loud. I tiptoed over, and sure enough, they were just playing with Legos and toys, causing a ruckus. Relieved, I went back to the living room and sat on the couch, turning on the TV. I muted it though, just in case I needed to listen again. That's when I heard it. A strange tapping noise coming from Sean's room. At first, I thought it was just one of the boys hitting the wall or the bed, but then it came again, and this time I could hear it clearly. It was coming from the window. Tap, tap, tap. I hesitated, thinking maybe it was just the wind or a branch scraping against the glass. Let them have their fun, I thought. After all, no one was screaming or crying. But then, the tapping stopped, and with it, everything went silent. Now let me tell you, if you've ever been around a group of 7-year-olds, you know that silence is a bad sign. I got up, heart pounding, and made my way back to Sean's door. I pressed my ear to it again. Nothing. No noise. No giggles. Not even a whisper. I opened the door. Inside, Sean and his friends were sitting on the floor, surrounded by toys. Something was off. The window, it was wide open. Cold air was blowing in, making the curtains flutter like something out of a horror movie. "Sean," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "why is the window open?" Sean and the other boys looked at me with wide eyes, clearly not understanding why I was upset. "We were playing," Sean said innocently, "but the pirate told us to keep it open." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "What pirate?" "The pirate," one of the other boys, Timmy, exclaimed. "He came to the window and said we were going to find treasure." I glanced around the room, counting the boys. Something was wrong. There were only 4 kids. "Where's Tom?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. The boys just blinked at me. "He went with the pirate," Sean said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Find the treasure." For a second, I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. There was no pirate. There couldn't be. But Tom wasn't in the room. Without thinking, I rushed to the window and leaned out, scanning the yard. That's when I saw him. A man holding Tom's hand, walking towards the street. I bolted down the hallway and out the front door, shouting at the top of my lungs, "Hey, stop!" The man froze. Slowly, he turned, and our eyes met. I'll never forget his face. He was smiling, a strange, twisted grin that made my skin crawl. He let go of Tom's hand, turned, and ran toward an old, tan-colored Toyota Corolla parked. The engine roared to life, and the car sped off down the street. I grabbed Tom and pulled him back into the house, slamming the door shut behind us. My heart was racing, and I could barely think straight. "What happened?" I demanded. "Who was that man?" "He said he was a pirate," Tom mumbled, rubbing his eyes like he was about to cry. "He said he had treasure." I felt sick. How could this happen in my own home? I had been right there, just a room away, and someone had almost taken my son's friend right under my nose. I made a quick decision. I wasn't going to let this sleepover continue. I called every single parent, telling them what had happened and that they needed to come get their kids immediately. The parents were understandably upset, but they didn't blame me. How could they? Who would ever expect something like this to happen in their own home? As I waited for the parents to arrive, I asked the boys to explain what happened again. "He knocked on the window," John said quietly. "He was dressed like a pirate. He had a big hat, and he talked funny. He said there was treasure outside, and he asked who wanted to come with him." "And Tom? You just went with him?" I asked, my voice shaking. Tom nodded. He looked fun. Fun. A man who almost kidnapped a child looked fun. When the parents arrived, they were as shocked as I was. They took their kids home, and I sat on the couch, staring at the empty living room. The silence was deafening. Days passed, but the incident haunted me. I couldn't shake the image of that man's face. His smile, the way he looked at me like I was the one intruding on his game. I reported the incident to the police, but they never found him. No one had seen the tan Toyota Corolla, and there were no leads. I started to question everything. How had this man known where to find us? How did he know the boys were in that room? Did he watch the house beforehand? The questions kept me up at night, gnawing at my mind like a relentless itch. Weeks turned into months, and though life returned to normal, a lingering fear remained. Sean didn't understand why he wasn't allowed to have sleepovers anymore. I didn't have the heart to tell him the truth, that I was terrified. Not just for him, but for the fact that someone had come into our lives, into our home, and left without a trace. One night, a few months after the incident, I was sitting in the living room, watching TV. The house was quiet, too quiet. Sean was asleep, my wife was upstairs reading, and the wind was howling outside. That's when I heard it again. Tap, 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 from Sean's window. I froze. Couldn't be. Not again. My body felt like it was made of stone as I slowly rose from the couch and crept down the hallway. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure whoever, or whatever, was outside could hear it. I reached Sean's door and hesitated, my hand trembling on the doorknob. Every instinct in my body told me to turn around, lock all the doors, call the police. But I couldn't leave my son in there, not after what had happened before. I pushed the door open, just a crack, enough to peek inside. Sean was asleep, bundled under his blanket, his small chest rising and falling with each breath. At the window was open again, just like that night. The curtains fluttered softly in the breeze, and the cold air bit at my skin. I felt a knot of fear twist in my gut as I stepped into the room, my eyes locked on the open window. Then, without warning, I heard it again, tap, 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 but this time it wasn't the window. It was coming from outside, near the bushes beneath the window, like something, or someone, was trying to get my attention. I swallowed hard and approached the window. Slowly, cautiously, I leaned out, my eyes scanning the dark yard. At first there was nothing but shadows, long, eerie shadows cast by the trees swaying in the wind. Then I saw it. Figure, standing by the fence at the edge of the yard. It was the same man, the same twisted grin. But this time, he wasn't dressed like a pirate. He was dressed like me. The man wore jeans, a flannel shirt, even a baseball cap like the one I wore. It was like he had studied me, mimicked me, and was now wearing my skin, haunting me. I felt bile rise in my throat as he raised his hand and waved, a slow, mocking gesture. My blood turned to ice. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but my voice was caught in my throat. All I could do was stare as the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. For a moment I stood frozen in place, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just seen. Who was he? How did he know so much about me? Why had he come back? I slammed the window shut, locked it, and then double-checked every lock in the house. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat by Sean's bed, watching him sleep, listening for any sound that didn't belong. In the following weeks, I became obsessed with figuring out who this man was. I installed security cameras around the house, checked the footage every night, but I never saw him again. The police said there wasn't much they could do without more information. I felt like I was losing my mind, like the fear was slowly consuming me. And then one night, I found something that made my blood run cold. I was going through the security footage from the night before, just like I had done every night since the man had reappeared. At first, everything looked normal, just hours of empty footage of the backyard. But then, around 2 a.m., there was a flash of movement near the fence. I rewound the footage, my heart pounding in my chest. It was him, the man from before. He was standing by the fence, just like the last time. But this time, he wasn't alone. He was holding the hand of a child. My stomach dropped as I leaned closer to the screen. The child looked exactly like Sean. Same pajamas, same tousled hair. But Sean had been in his bed all night. I had been there, watching him sleep. I rewound the footage again and again, trying to make sense of it. Was it a trick of the light? Coincidence? Or was it something worse? I didn't know what to believe anymore. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man's face, his grin, and the way he had worn my clothes, stood in my yard, and waved at me like he knew everything about me. I became paranoid, barely leaving the house, keeping Sean close at all times. My wife grew concerned, but I couldn't explain it to her. How could I? How could I tell her that there was a man out there who knew us, who could mimic us, and who had almost taken our son? The final straw came one night, when Sean came to me with a drawing. It was a crude picture, drawn in crayon, of a man standing outside a window, waving. Next to him, a boy held his hand, smiling. The boy looked just like Sean. I don't like him, Sean said. His voice small and scared. He keeps coming back. He says he's you, but I know he's not. Stared at the drawing, my heart racing. Sean, when did you see him? Last night, he whispered. He was outside my window. He wanted me to come with him, but I didn't. I told him you said I wasn't allowed to go outside at night. I felt cold sweat run down my back. This was it. I couldn't ignore it anymore. That night, I called the police again, but they didn't believe me. They thought it was a case of mistaken identity, or maybe a neighbor playing a prank. But I knew better. I knew that the man was still out there, watching, waiting. Months later, we moved away. I couldn't live in that house anymore, knowing that he had been there, so close to taking my son. Even now, in a new town, in a new home, I still check the windows every night. I still listen for the sound of tapping on the glass. And every time I hear it, whether it's the wind, a branch, or something else, can't help but wonder if he's back. If he's still out there, waiting for another chance. The thought keeps me awake at night. Because the truth is, no matter how far you run, some things, some nightmares follow you wherever you go. The air was thick with humidity, and the evening sun had begun its slow descent behind the trees. That time of day always brought a sense of quiet restlessness to the town, where nothing much ever happened. For 3 teenagers who were bored and itching for something more, tonight would be different. An adventure they would never forget. I'm telling you, let's just go behind my house. We don't need to go into the woods, Chris said, standing by the open window of his room, lighting a cigarette. His blue hoodie was frayed at the sleeves, and his hands shook slightly as he held the cigarette to his lips. Beside him, Jenna rolled her eyes. She was tall, blonde, and had an attitude as sharp as her looks. Come on, Chris. Behind your house is boring. We've done that 100 times. It's Friday night. Let's do something more fun. Fun, like getting lost in the woods? Eric added with a grin, tossing his backpack over his shoulder. He was the joker of the group, always ready with a sarcastic remark. His shaggy brown hair and careless demeanor made it seem like nothing ever fazed him. I'm down, but I don't want to hear any whining when you both freak out over a raccoon or something. The woods aren't that bad, Jenna said, grabbing Chris's wrist. We'll just smoke, hang out for a bit, and head back. No big deal. Chris sighed. Fine, but we're not staying long, and no exploring random creepy path. Got it? Yeah. Jenna waved him off. Let's go. The trio set off from Chris's house, which bordered a quiet neighborhood that crept dangerously close to the woods. The trees loomed over the houses like silent watchers, their branches gnarled and twisted in ways that seemed unnatural. The entrance to the woods was just a short walk away, a gap in the tree line that beckoned them forward. The moment they crossed into the woods, the atmosphere shifted. It was cooler in there, the air still and thick with the scent of damp earth. Chris felt a twinge of regret as they walked deeper, but he didn't say anything. The others seemed at ease, laughing and joking about how dumb their school was or how their parents didn't understand anything. For a while, it was fun. They smoked, laughed, and told stories, their voices bouncing off the trees. But as the sun sank lower and the sky dimmed to a dusky gray, something changed. The woods grew quieter, too quiet. I think we should head back, Chris said, his voice low. He flicked the ash from his cigarette and looked around. It's getting late, Jenna smirked. Scared already? No, just not dumb enough to get lost in here after dark. Eric snickered, but Chris noticed that even he was glancing around a bit more now. He's right, Eric said, surprising them both. These woods get weird at night. They started back toward the way they came, but the sense of unease hung in the air like a fog. Chris kept his eyes trained on the ground, trying to follow the path they had taken, but the woods seemed different now. The trees were closer together, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. It wasn't long before they saw it. Old blue Chevy truck parked near the entrance to the woods. That's weird, Chris muttered, pulse quickening. The truck hadn't been there when they entered. It was an old, rusted thing, the kind you'd expect to see abandoned in a junkyard, not parked ominously near a darkened path. Jenna stopped laughing. Who do you think it belongs to? Eric shrugged, though he looked uneasy. Maybe some redneck. Let's just keep walking." But as they moved closer, the truck's engine roared to life, its headlights blaring like two blazing eyes fixed on them. Without thinking, Chris grabbed Jenna's arm, yanking her backward as the truck lurched forward. "Run!" Chris yelled, his heart slamming in his chest. They bolted down the path, branches whipping their faces as they sprinted deeper into the woods. The truck followed, its engine revving angrily, headlights cutting through the darkness. "This isn't happening. This isn't happening," Jenna whispered, half to herself, as they scrambled over fallen logs and roots. Eric was panting hard beside them, his face pale. "Who the hell is driving that thing?" Chris didn't answer. His mind was racing, trying to figure out where they could go. They couldn't outrun a truck, not in these woods. But if they could just get to the hill, the one that sloped down sharply, they might be able to lose it. "There! The hill!" Chris shouted, pointing. The three of them slid down the steep incline, gravel and dirt flying beneath their feet as they crashed to the bottom. The truck roared above them, its headlights scanning the area, but it couldn't follow them down the hill. For a moment, they were safe. Catching his breath, Chris crouched low behind a thick tree trunk, peering through the branches. The truck had stopped at the top of the hill, its engine idling. "What now?" Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. "We wait," Chris replied. "Just stay quiet." Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Eventually, the truck's engine cut off, and the headlights blinked out. Silence fell over the woods once more, and Chris felt a flicker of hope. Maybe whoever was driving had given up. Then they heard it. The slow, deliberate crunch of boots on gravel. Someone was coming down the hill. Chris's heart pounded in his ears as he pressed himself against the tree, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps were slow, methodical, like whoever was coming knew exactly where they were. "Stay still," Chris whispered, his hand clutching Jenna's. Footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right above them. Chris could hear the sound of heavy breathing, could almost feel the person's presence through the dark. And then, just as suddenly, footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. Chris didn't move. Neither did Jenna or Eric. They sat frozen, waiting, praying that whoever it was would turn around and leave. But instead, a low, raspy voice cut through the darkness like a knife. "I know you're down there," the voice said. Chris felt a chill run down his spine. It was the voice of an older man, gravelly and cold. "You think you can hide from me?" the voice continued, taunting them. "I've been watching you the whole time." Jenna whimpered softly, and Chris squeezed her hand tighter, trying to keep her calm. The man's voice was getting closer, footsteps resuming their slow, menacing approach. "Come on out," the man said. "I just want to talk." Chris's mind raced. Couldn't stay there. If they waited any longer, the man would find them. But if they ran, where would they go? Before he could decide, Eric suddenly bolted from behind the tree, sprinting into the woods. "Eric, no!" Chris hissed, but it was too late. The man let out a sickening laugh and took off after him. Jenna sobbed quietly as the sounds of pursuit faded into the distance. "What do we do, Chris? What do we do?" Chris swallowed hard, his throat dry. "We go back to the house. Now, we'll figure out what happened to Eric later. We can't help him if pot." Jenna nodded, face pale. They didn't waste any more time. Chris and Jenna didn't speak as they ran through the dense forest, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves and underbrush. Every muscle in Chris's body was tense, his heart pounding in his ears as they navigated through the maze of trees. Every shadow felt like it was closing in on them, every sound in the woods amplified by their heightened fear. There was no turning back now. They had to get out. Chris glanced back over his shoulder. The woods stretched endlessly behind them, thick and oppressive. There was no sign of the man, but Eric's sudden disappearance gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the sound of the man's voice, a sick amusement in his words, like he was enjoying their fear. "We have to get out of here," Jenna panted, stumbling over a fallen branch. She caught herself and kept running, tears streaming down her face. "Chris, I'm scared." "I know," Chris said, though fear was tearing at him too. He kept his voice steady for her sake. "Just a little further. The woods end soon." But even as he said it, he wasn't entirely sure where they were anymore. The woods, which had seemed so familiar just a few hours ago, now felt like an endless labyrinth. His phone had no signal, and the sun had long since dipped below the horizon. Darkness settled in fast. They kept running, breathless, until the sight of something stopped them dead in their track. Up ahead, barely visible in the dim light, was a small cabin. It stood alone, rotting and forgotten, just a few yards off the path. The windows were cracked, the door barely hanging on its rusted hinges. The place reeked of abandonment, but at the same time, felt like someone, or something, was watching them from the inside. "No," Jenna gasped, shaking her head as if she already knew what Chris was thinking. "No way, we're not going in there." Chris hesitated. He knew it was a bad idea, but if the man was still out there, if he was hunting them, they needed somewhere to hide, at least for a little while. The cabin was the only option. "We don't have a choice," Chris said, his voice hoarse. "We can hide in there, just for a bit, until we know it's safe." Jenna didn't argue further. Her legs were trembling, and her breaths came in ragged gasps. Without another word, they moved toward the cabin. Chris pushed the door open, the old wood creaking loudly in protest. The smell of mildew and rot hit them immediately, and Chris gagged, pulling his hoodie up over his nose. The inside was worse than the outside, dark, damp, and filled with broken furniture and old debris. "Close the door," Jenna whispered, glancing nervously behind them. "Please." Chris shut the door softly, wincing at the sound. The cabin was silent, save for the distant rustle of leaves outside. They both stood still, trying to listen for any sign of the man, but all they could hear was the eerie quiet of the forest at night. "There's no way that guy's still following us, right?" Jenna whispered. Her voice shook. There was a glimmer of hope in it. Maybe we lost him. Chris didn't want to give her false hope, but he nodded anyway. "Yeah, maybe." They sat down on the floor, leaning against the wall, trying to catch their breath. For a few moments, the only sound was the rhythmic rise and fall of their heavy breathing. But something about the cabin felt off. There was an unsettling presence to it. The walls themselves were holding some dark secret. Chris's gaze wandered around the small, cluttered space. There were old beer cans and dirty clothes scattered on the floor, signs that someone had lived here recently. He noticed a small door at the back of the cabin, partially hidden by a tattered curtain. Something about it made his skin crawl. "We should just wait until morning," Jenna murmured, wrapping her arms around herself. "We'll leave as soon as the sun comes up." Chris was about to agree when they heard it. A noise outside. Faint at first, like a distant rustle of leaves, but then unmistakable. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and growing closer. Chris's stomach twisted into knots. Jenna's eyes widened in terror as she grabbed Chris's arm. "He's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Chris motioned for her to stay quiet. He slowly stood up, creeping toward the nearest window to get a glimpse of what was outside. The cabin had no electricity, and the darkness was nearly impenetrable. The faint outline of a figure moved just outside the cabin. It was him, the man from the truck. Chris ducked back down, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might give them away. Crawled back toward Jenna, who was frozen with fear. "He's outside," Chris mouthed, barely making a sound. Jenna's face paled. Her hand flew to her mouth to stifle a sob. Chris racked his brain, trying to come up with a plan, but there was no way out. The man was blocking the door, and the windows were too small to crawl through without making noise. Suddenly, there was a loud thud from the door. Chris and Jenna both jumped, eyes wide with terror. The man was trying to get in. Thud, thud. Each knock was deliberate, as if the man was toying with them, letting them know he could break down the door whenever he wanted. "We have to hide," Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. "We have to find somewhere to hide." Chris glanced around the small cabin, but there was nowhere, except for the small door at the back, the one that had made his skin crawl earlier. He didn't have a choice. "Come on," he whispered, grabbing Jenna's hand and pulling her toward the back of the cabin. "Quick." They moved as quietly as they could, slipping behind the curtain and pushing open the small door. It led to a narrow staircase, descending into what looked like a cellar. Chris hesitated for a moment, the musty, damp air hitting him like a wave. The stairs creaked under their weight as they descended into the darkness. The cellar was small and cramped, with low ceilings and dirt floors. Old tools and jars lined the shelves, coated in dust. They crouched in the corner, holding their breaths. hoping the man wouldn't find the hidden door. Above them, the thuds continued, each one more violent than the last. Crash! The door to the cabin burst open, and heavy footsteps echoed through the space above them. Chris squeezed Jenna's hand, his mind racing. The man was inside now, searching for them. Every creak of the floorboards above sent waves of panic through Chris's body. Then suddenly, the footsteps stopped. A moment of deafening silence. Chris strained to listen, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound. He didn't dare to breathe. And then, without warning, the cellar door above them swung open. The man stood at the top of the stairs, silhouetted against the faint light. His face was hidden in shadow, but his presence filled the room like a storm cloud. "I told you I'd find you," the man said, his voice dripping with malice. Jenna let out a strangled sob as Chris pulled her closer. There was no way out now. Chris and Jenna huddled in the corner, their eyes wide with terror as the man descended the stairs one slow, deliberate step at a time. The dim light from above cast eerie shadows on his face, highlighting his hollow eyes and malevolent gaze. He didn't need to say much. His presence alone was enough to drive them into despair. The man paused halfway down the stairs, his eyes fixed intently on them. Chris felt those eyes, cold, probing, examining them as if he already knew what they had done, or worse, what they had seen. "You weren't supposed to be here." The man's voice was rough, his words deliberate and heavy with menace. "Not tonight, not in this place." Jenna trembled, her voice breaking in fear. "We didn't see anything. We got lost. Please just let us go." The man's lips curled into a thin, chilling smile. "Didn't see anything?" He tilted his head, as if pondering the absurdity of their claim. "It's hard to believe, but perhaps you did see something you weren't supposed to. Something you were never meant to witness." Chris frowned, struggling to grasp the full meaning behind his words. "We don't understand. We didn't see anything. We just went into the woods. We just want to leave." The man's gaze was unfathomable as he assessed their sincerity. "There are secrets in those woods," said slowly, his tone dripping with dark implication. "Secrets that sometimes one must protect at all costs." Chris and Jenna held their breath. They had made a terrible mistake, that much was clear. But now, there was no way back. The man took a step back up the stairs, his demeanor shifting as if he had made a final, dreadful decision. "Don't worry," he said, his voice dripping with ominous finality. "You won't have to worry about what you've seen, because you'll never be able to leave." Cast one last look at them, his eyes still cold and unfeeling. Then, with a slow and deliberate motion, he began to close the hatch. The sound of the hinge creaking shut was terrifyingly slow, each moment dragging out their dread. Chris scrambled to the hatch, desperately trying to pry it open, but it was too late. Jenna screamed in horror. The lock clicked into place, a heavy and final sound. But that wasn't all. Chris heard the scraping noise of metal against metal, as if the man was adding something heavy on top of the hatch. They were trapped, sealed in the darkness below, with no way to escape. Chris pounded on the hatch, his fists striking futilely against the impenetrable barrier. "Open the door, please. We didn't see anything. Open the door." No response came, only the sound of the man's retreating footsteps, growing fainter and fainter, until they were completely gone. Jenna slumped to the floor, tears streaming down her face. "What do we do now?" she whispered, her voice trembling with despair. Chris didn't answer. In the suffocating darkness, all hope seemed to evaporate. They were trapped, buried alive in this cellar, with no one knowing they were here. No one would come to save them. The silence in the cellar was oppressive, broken only by the sound of their labored breathing. They knew they might never escape this place, and the man, he was gone, but his shadow would forever linger in this endless night. The wind howled faintly through the cracks above, bearing with it the man's final, chilling message. "Don't worry. You won't have to worry about what you've seen, ever again." The story ends here, but the fate of Chris and Jenna remains unresolved, haunting them in the dark, inescapable void. It was a chilly September night in rural Virginia, the kind of night where the cold seeps into your bones and makes you shiver, even if you're wrapped in layers. Zachary Lawson, a 27-year-old, who had recently moved into a small, creaky house on the outskirts of town, was making his way home from a local bar. The place was the only hangout spot in their sleepy town, a place that roared with college students and locals every weekend. Zach had spent the night there with a group of friends, drinking and laughing, trying to escape the monotony of his quiet life. As the clock neared 2 a.m., he said his goodbyes and stumbled out into the chilly night, eager to get back to his own bed. The walk home was a short one, just 3 blocks from the bar to his small old house. Zach fumbled with his keys, trying to find the right one as he approached his front stoop. But something felt off. The front door was ajar. He froze, his inebriated brain trying to make sense of the situation. He knew he had locked the door before he left. The darkness inside the house was almost palpable. Zach pushed the door open slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. He stepped inside and immediately noticed a note on the kitchen counter. It was written in his mother's familiar handwriting, though the words were shaky, like she was holding the pen with a trembling hand. "Zach, you left this at our house. Came to clean a bit and bring you some cake. Love, Mom." Zach sighed. It was the same old story. His mother, Betty, in her early 60s and growing increasingly worrisome with age, had a habit of showing up unannounced. She had even managed to get a spare tea from Zach when he was feeling particularly soft-hearted. He didn't mind her visits, but this late at night, it was a bit much. He assumed Betty had come over, made her usual rounds of cleaning, and then went upstairs to sleep in the guest room, as she often did. Zach didn't see her anywhere downstairs, so he headed upstairs to check on her. The stairs creaked under his weight, the sound of each step amplified by the silence of the house. The guest bedroom was empty. Zach's heart began to race. If Betty was having one of her episodes due to her worsening memory, she might be wandering around. Checked the bathrooms, but she wasn't there either. Growing increasingly anxious, Zach grabbed his phone and dialed his father, Robert. The phone rang 4 times before his father answered, his voice heavy with sleep. "Zach, what's wrong?" "I heard footsteps upstairs, Dad. I think Mom might be having an episode. She's not in the guest room or any of the bathrooms. I'm really worried." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Zach could almost hear the gears turning in his father's head. "That's not possible," Robert finally said, his voice tinged with confusion. "She's right here with me. She's been in bed for hours." Zach's blood ran cold. Turned his head toward the darkened staircase. A shadow, a vague outline of a head, was peering around the corner at the top of the stairs. His heart pounded in his chest. Panic surged through him, and he screamed into the phone. "I see something upstairs. I'm getting out of here." Without waiting for a response, Zach bolted down the stairs, threw open the front door, and ran out into the street. He could hear the distant wail of sirens as he sprinted toward his parents' house. Breath came in ragged gasps as he explained the situation to his father over the phone. When he arrived at his parents' home, porch light cast a warm glow over the front yard. Betty was waiting at the door, her face etched with concern. Zach was barely able to catch his breath as he explained what had happened. Robert, having heard the commotion, was already on the phone with the police. The officers arrived quickly. 2 patrol cars pulled up to the driveway, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows on the ground. Zach and his father waited outside as the officers went into Zach's house to investigate. Zach paced nervously, cold night air stinging his skin. Every rustle of the leaves, every distant sound, seemed amplified. After what felt like an eternity, the officers emerged. "There's no sign of forced entry or anything suspicious," one officer said. "The house is clear. We checked the attic, crawl space, and every room. It looks like someone might have left the door unlocked." Zach's heart sank. The officer's words made sense. It was possible that Betty had accidentally left the door open after cleaning, but Zach couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister had happened. The officer's words did little to ease the gnawing dread in his gut. That night, Zach stayed at his parents' house. He couldn't bring himself to sleep in his own home, not after what he had seen or thought he had seen. The shadow at the top of the stairs haunted him. He lay awake in the guest room, every creak of the house making him jump. In the days that followed, Zach's unease didn't fade. He found himself constantly checking the locks on his doors and windows, peering into dark corners as if expecting to see that shadow again. His father decided to stop Betty from coming over alone, a decision that Zach understood, hated to see. Betty's condition was worsening, and the safety of her actions was becoming a growing concern. Zach's anxiety remained even after his parents knew precautions. Every time he walked into his house, he half expected to find something or someone lurking in the dark. The memory of the shadow and the chilling realization that someone had been in his house gnawed at him, leaving him restless and jumpy. One night, a few weeks later, Zach was alone in his house, trying to read a book to distract himself from his fears. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. A sudden noise, like a faint knock, startled him. His heart raced as he looked around, trying to locate the source of the sound. It came again, a soft tapping, as if someone was knocking on the door or the walls. He got up, trembling, and went to check the front door. It was locked. Tapping continued, growing louder, and it seemed to come from the upstairs. Zach's mind raced. Had someone returned? Was it the same shadowy figure from that night? He grabbed a flashlight and slowly made his way up the stairs, each step echoing in the silence. As he reached the top, the tapping ceased. He checked every room, every closet, but found nothing. The house seemed empty, but the eerie feeling remained. In the days following, Zach couldn't shake the sense of being watched. He started avoiding the house as much as possible, spending more time at his parents' place or with friends. He found solace in the company of others, far away from the haunting emptiness of his own home. One evening, as Zach was visiting his parents, Robert approached him with a serious expression. "Zach, I need to show you something," he said, leading Zach to the basement. Zach's anxiety flared up as he followed his father down the stairs. The basement was dimly lit, filled with old furniture and boxes. Robert moved to a corner and pulled out a dusty box. He opened it, revealing a collection of old photographs and documents. Among them was a faded, black and white picture of a house that looked strikingly similar to Zach's. "This was the house before we bought it," Robert said. "I found these while going through some old records. I don't know why, but I felt like you should see them." Zach stared at the photographs, his heart pounding. The house in the picture had the same layout, the same creaky stairs, and the same eerie feeling that had been haunting him. But there was something else in the photograph, an indistinct figure standing in the doorway, almost hidden in the shadows. The realization hit Zach like a cold wave. The house had a history, and whatever was lurking in its dark corners had been there long before he moved in. The feeling of dread that had been growing inside him was not just his imagination. It was connected to something far more sinister. Zach's paranoia only deepened as he tried to make sense of the new revelation. The shadow, the tapping, the sense of being watched, it all seemed to fit into a pattern he couldn't ignore. He began to question the safety of his own home, unsure if he would ever truly feel at ease there again. In the end, Zach couldn't escape the feeling that whatever was haunting his house had become a part of him. He continued to live in his old house, but he never felt completely alone. The darkness that lurked in the corners and the shadows that seemed to move on their own were constant reminders of the mystery that had taken root in his life. And though he tried to rationalize it, deep down, he knew that the house would always hold its secrets. Secrets that would forever keep him on edge, even in the comfort of his own home.